Something strange is happening inside one of the most organized religious systems in the United States, and almost no one is talking about it openly. Across hundreds of congregations, the men who hold the day-to-day spiritual authority of the Mormon Church are quietly walking away. There is no press release. There is no official announcement from Salt Lake City. There is no public statement from the First Presidency acknowledging what insiders have been whispering about for months. And yet, when you sit down with former leaders, when you read the internal surveys, when you compare the numbers across the last 15 years, a pattern begins to emerge that the institution would prefer you never noticed. This is the story of the bishops, the unpaid, untrained, often exhausted men who carry the emotional weight of entire wards on their shoulders while juggling full-time jobs, marriages, and children of their own. It is the story of a structure that demands everything and offers almost nothing in return. And it is the story of what happens when the people holding a religious system together begin to quietly break, one by one, in living rooms and parking lots and late-night conversations they never wanted to have. What you are about to hear is not speculation. It is built on data from inside the church, on testimonies from men who served and could no longer continue, and on a growing body of evidence that points to a crisis hiding in plain sight. By the end of this video, you may understand why some observers are now calling this the silent collapse of Mormon local leadership. And you may also understand why the institution itself has every reason to keep the conversation buried. Because what we found, when we started pulling the threads, was not the story of a few tired men. It was the story of a system that may no longer be sustainable in the form it has existed for nearly 2 centuries. Part 1. To understand what is happening, you first have to understand what a Mormon bishop actually is, because the title is misleading. In most religious traditions, a bishop is a senior figure, often with formal theological training, a salary, a staff, and decades of preparation behind him. In the Mormon Church, the reality could not be more different. A Mormon bishop is a regular man pulled from the congregation, often with no warning, asked to lead a ward of several hundred people for roughly 5 years. He receives no payment. He receives no professional training in counseling, in psychology, in conflict resolution, or in trauma response. He is expected to learn on the job, while still working 40 or 50 hours a week at his regular career, while still raising his own family, while still being a husband and a father and a neighbor. And the responsibilities placed on his shoulders are staggering. He becomes the spiritual leader of the congregation. He becomes a counselor for marriages falling apart. He becomes the judge in worthiness interviews, where members confess intimate details of their personal lives. He becomes the crisis manager when a teenager runs away, when a family loses a job, when a member is hospitalized, when someone dies. He sits across the desk from women disclosing abuse. He sits across the desk from men confessing addictions. He absorbs the secrets, the shame, the fear, and the pain of hundreds of strangers who suddenly become his responsibility the moment he is called. And he does all of this for free, without a single dollar of compensation, without a single hour of formal psychological training, without the option, in most cases, to say no when the calling comes. Now place that reality next to a simple comparison. In the United States, surveys conducted by groups like Barna Research and Lifeway have found that around 24% of Protestant pastors have seriously considered leaving the ministry in recent years. And during the peak of the pandemic crisis, that figure climbed close to 40%. These are men with salaries, benefits, seminary training, and the cultural permission to step away if needed. And still, nearly half of them have thought about quitting. Now imagine the same emotional load, the same pastoral demands, the same weight of human suffering placed on a man who has none of those protections. No salary, no training, no real exit. That is the position of a Mormon bishop in 2026. Part 2. Let me tell you about a man we will call David. He is real. His name is not David. We are protecting his identity because he still lives in the same community where he served, and his children still attend the same ward. David served as a bishop in a mid-sized city in the western United States for just under 4 years. When he was called, he was 41 years old. He had a stable career in finance, 3 children, a wife who supported him completely, and what he describes today as a quiet but genuine faith. When he was released, he was 45. He had lost 23 pounds. He had been prescribed medication for anxiety. His marriage was barely holding together, and he had not slept a full night in over 2 years. David told us that the breaking point did not come from one big event. It came from a Tuesday, a normal Tuesday. He had worked a full day at his office, come home for 40 minutes to eat dinner with his family, and then driven back to the meeting house for what was supposed to be a routine evening of appointments. The first appointment was a young mother disclosing that her husband had been hitting her. The second was a teenage boy confessing something he had never told anyone in his life. The third was an older couple whose adult son had just died by suicide, and who wanted to know if their boy was now lost forever. David sat in that small office, under fluorescent lights, listening to 3 human tragedies in a row, with no training, no supervisor, no therapist to call afterward, and no one he was allowed to talk to about any of it. He drove home at 11:30 at night. His wife was already asleep. He sat in the driveway for almost an hour, unable to walk into his own house. That was the night, he told us, that something inside him quietly turned off and never came back on. David's story is not unusual. It is, in fact, almost a template. Internal surveys conducted among active Latter-day Saints in recent years have produced a figure that should stop anyone in their tracks. According to data circulated in Mormon mental health forums and confirmed by multiple independent researchers studying religious burnout, around 95% of surveyed members report experiencing burnout, spiritual fatigue, or emotional exhaustion connected to their church responsibilities. 95%. That is not a fringe of disgruntled members. That is virtually the entire active body of the church reporting that the system is wearing them down. And if 95% of regular members feel that way, imagine what the bishops feel. Because burnout in this context is not simply being tired after a long week. It is the slow erosion that comes from constant moral pressure, from the expectation of perfection, from being available at every hour, from carrying confidential weight you cannot share with your wife, your friends, or even your own family. It is the exhaustion of being the person everyone turns to when their world is falling apart, while having no one to turn to yourself. Bishops sit at the center of the heaviest pastoral situations the church produces, and they absorb that suffering in silence, year after year, without any of the professional tools that exist precisely to keep human beings from breaking under that kind of weight. Part 3. While the bishops are quietly burning out, the ground beneath them is also shifting, because the congregations they are leading are not what they used to be. The data on Mormon retention in the United States tells a story the church is reluctant to confront. According to research compiled by sociologists studying American religion, including work referenced by the Pew Research Center and independent surveys of former members, retention rates among Latter-day Saints in the United States hovered around 70% in 2007. By the most recent estimates available in 2023 and 2024, that figure had dropped to around 54%. Among younger generations, the numbers are even sharper. Studies have suggested that up to 55% of young Latter-day Saints raised in the faith are walking away before they reach full adulthood, and the inactive population is enormous. Estimates indicate that around 60% of nominal Latter-day Saints in the United States are considered inactive, meaning they are on the membership rolls but rarely or never attend. So when a bishop is called to lead a ward of, say, 600 members on paper, he may actually be working with 200 or fewer who show up regularly. And his job is not just to serve those who attend. His job is to chase the ones who don't, to reactivate the inactive, to retain the youth, to bring back the families who have drifted, to rebuild what is quietly disappearing. David described this part of the job as the most demoralizing of all. Every month, his stake president would ask for activation numbers. Every month, the numbers would be slightly worse than the month before. Every month, David would be told to try harder, to visit more families, to give more talks, to organize more activities. And every month, more chairs in the chapel would sit empty. He told us it felt like being asked to bail water out of a sinking boat with a teaspoon, while being blamed for the rising water. This creates a psychological paradox that any leadership expert will recognize immediately. More responsibility, with fewer results. More effort, with less reward. More hours, with less visible fruit. That combination is one of the fastest paths to burnout known in any organizational structure, religious or otherwise. And the bishops are living it every week, often without even realizing what is happening to them, because the culture of the church frames exhaustion as faithfulness and frames doubt as weakness. Part 4. There is another layer to this crisis that almost no one outside the institution understands, and it has to do with the gap between where decisions are made and where their consequences land. In the Mormon Church, all major doctrinal, financial, and policy choices are made at the very top by a small group of men in Salt Lake City. The bishop has no vote. He has no input. He receives the policies in handbooks and is expected to enforce them, defend them, and explain them to people whose lives those policies directly affect. Think about what that means in practice. When the news broke about the Ensign Peak Investment Fund, the $100 billion reserve that had been built quietly through decades of tithing, while local congregations were told there was never enough money for chapel maintenance, the bishops were the ones who had to face their members the following Sunday. They had not invested that money. They had never even been told it existed. But they were the ones who had to look an elderly widow in the eye when she asked why she had been encouraged to give her last pennies to a church that was sitting on a fortune larger than most countries. When the policies on LGBTQ members shifted, then shifted again, then shifted a third time, the bishops were the ones counseling families torn apart by those decisions. They had no voice in writing them. They simply had to absorb the anger, the grief, and the betrayal of members who could no longer reconcile what they were being told with what they believed. This is the impossible position of the modern bishop. He is the public face of an institution whose decisions he does not make and often does not fully understand. He is asked to defend historical claims that professional historians within the church itself have quietly walked back. He is asked to enforce worthiness standards that he may privately question. He is asked to project unwavering certainty in a moment when even the most faithful members are starting to ask harder questions. And he has to do all of this knowing that any expression of his own doubt would end his calling, damage his family, and possibly cost him friendships built over a lifetime. So he swallows it. He smiles. He reassures. He goes home. And the weight builds, week after week, until something gives. And here we arrive at the part of the story that almost no one talks about openly. The reason this crisis is invisible is not because it isn't happening. It is invisible because of how it ends. Mormon bishops, in most cases, do not quit dramatically. They do not write public letters. They do not give interviews. They do not appear on podcasts denouncing the institution. The culture of the church makes that almost unthinkable for a man still trying to hold his family and his faith together. Instead, they endure. They push through. They tell themselves that the calling is from God and that endurance is a form of righteousness. They tell themselves that asking for help would be a sign of weakness. They tell themselves that stepping down early would disappoint their wives, their children, their stake president, and the Lord himself. So they finish their term exhausted, hollowed out, sometimes physically ill, and they walk away without a word of explanation. Or they request to be released early, citing vague health reasons or family circumstances, and the church quietly moves on to the next man in line. There is no exit interview. There is no public conversation. There is no acknowledgement that anything has gone wrong. That is why there is no headline. That is why there is no scandal. That is why the institution can continue to project an image of strength and stability while, underneath, the men holding it all together are quietly collapsing one by one. The crisis is real. The numbers are real. The exhaustion is real. But it has been engineered by culture and by silence to remain completely invisible to the outside world. And the longer it stays invisible, the harder it becomes for the men inside it to even name what is happening to them. David told us that for almost 2 years after his release, he could not find words for what he had been through. He only knew that something had been taken from him that he was not sure he would ever get back. So when you step back and look at the full picture, the question changes. It is no longer simply why Mormon bishops are stepping down. The real question is how much longer a system like this can sustain itself before the cracks become impossible to hide. Because when the people who hold a religious institution together at the local level begin to break in such large numbers, you are no longer looking at a leadership problem. You are looking at a structural one. The Mormon Church in the United States is shrinking. Its retention is falling. Its young people are leaving. Its inactive roles are growing. Its trust is eroding. And the men who are supposed to hold the line, the bishops, are doing it without pay, without training, without rest, and without permission to admit how heavy it has become. If you have ever served in a calling like this, or if you have watched a husband or a father do it, you already know what these numbers feel like from the inside. You know the late nights. You know the silent drives home. You know the look in his eyes when he thinks no one is watching. And you know that what is happening is not a crisis of faith. It is a crisis of weight, a weight no single man was ever meant to carry alone. Maybe the real question is not whether the bishops will keep stepping down. Maybe the real question is, what happens to a church when there is finally no one left willing to take their place? If you served as a bishop, or if you watched your father, your husband, or your brother serve in that calling, leave a comment below and tell us what you saw. Tell us what it cost. Tell us what no one outside that office will ever understand. Your testimony matters here because the men inside the institution almost never get to speak, and the silence has protected the system for far too long. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next investigation, and share this video with anyone who needs to understand what is really happening behind the closed doors of Mormon local leadership. Because the only way this conversation begins is if the people who lived it finally decide to break the silence themselves.